April 9, 2021. The bedroom at Windsor Castle was quiet. No cameras. No courtiers hovering at the door. Just a woman who had spent 70 years as a queen, sitting beside the man she had loved since she was 13 years old, watching him leave. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was gone at 99. And in the days that followed, the tributes poured in the flags, the gun salutes, the carefully worded statements from palaces and governments around the world. But one question refused to be buried alongside him. Why, in the final years of his life, had Philip chosen not to live with his wife? Why had the man who stood one step behind the most powerful woman in Britain for 7 decades quietly packed up and moved to a country estate alone? For years, that question circled like smoke that nobody wanted to breathe in. Royal commentators offered theories. Tabloids ran headlines. Insiders whispered. But the people who actually knew, the children who grew up watching their parents navigate one of the most unusual marriages in modern history, said almost nothing, till Princess Anne spoke. And what she revealed was not the scandal people had been waiting for. It was something far more human. And in some ways, far more heartbreaking. To understand why Philip left, you have to understand who Philip was before he became the man walking 3 steps behind a queen. He was born on a kitchen table on the Greek island of Corfu in 1921. His father was Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. His mother, Princess Alice, would later be diagnosed with a mental illness and committed to a sanatorium, essentially disappearing from his childhood. By the time Philip was 10, his family had been exiled from Greece, his parents had separated, and he was being passed between relatives across Europe like a piece of luggage no one quite knew what to do with. He grew up in borrowed rooms in borrowed countries. He was royalty without a kingdom. A prince without a home. That detail matters. Because everything Philip did for the rest of his life, every wall he built, every frustration he swallowed, every room he eventually walked out of, traces back to that boy who never had solid ground beneath his feet. He found something close to solid ground in Elizabeth. They first met properly in 1939 at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. She was 13. He was 18. By every account, she was immediately captivated. Philip was tall, confident, almost aggressively alive in a way that made rooms feel smaller. He was the kind of young man who took up space not because he demanded it, but because he simply could not help it. She watched him. She could not stop watching him. And somewhere beneath that naval uniform and that easy smile, Philip noticed. They wrote letters, dozens of them. Through the war years, while Philip served in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters and earned genuine citations for bravery under fire, Elizabeth wrote to him. She was a teenager in love for the first time, and every word she put on paper said so. When the war ended and Philip came home, the outcome was never really in doubt. They were engaged in 1947. Married that same year in Westminster Abbey, with the world still wearing the grey exhaustion of war, watching 2 young people in love and choosing, for a few hours, to believe in something beautiful. For a while, it was exactly that. They settled into Clarence House, and by all private accounts those were the happiest years of their marriage. Philip was building something, a naval career, a family, a life that felt genuinely his. 4 children arrived. Charles, and Andrew, Edward. Philip was a hands-on father by the standards of his era and his class, which meant he was more present than most men of his world, even if presence sometimes came wrapped in discipline. And, the only daughter, became his shadow. She rode like him. She competed like him. She had his directness and his refusal to perform emotions she did not feel. Of all 4 children, she understood him best. Then King George VI died in February 1952. Elizabeth was in Kenya when she got the news. She came home a princess and left the plane a queen. And with that, the life Philip had been carefully constructing for himself was quietly dismantled. The move to Buckingham Palace was the first blow. Clarence House had been theirs. Philip had overseen its renovation himself, chosen the fittings, arranged the rooms. Buckingham Palace belonged to the institution. It belonged to history. It was 775 rooms of marble and protocol and staff and eyes, always eyes, and Philip had no claim over any of it. He walked its corridors as a guest who happened to be married to the owner. The second blow was the name. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, the question of what the royal house would be called became a point of quiet but devastating conflict. Philip believed reasonably, by any normal standard, that the house should take his name. Mountbatten. That is how it works for most married couples. The children carry the father's name. The family carries the father's name. But Queen Mary, Elizabeth's formidable grandmother, had other ideas. The house would remain Windsor. It had always been Windsor. It would stay Windsor. Elizabeth signed the declaration on April 9, 1952. The royal house would continue under the name Windsor. Philip did not hide what he felt. He said it plainly, with the kind of controlled fury of a man who has trained himself not to shout. I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children. He was not wrong. And no one disputed it. The decision stood anyway. Something shifted in him after that. Not immediately, and not dramatically. Philip was not a man who crumbled. He was a man who absorbed. He kept showing up. He fulfilled every duty. He stood at Elizabeth's side at every engagement, every tour, every Commonwealth visit, every dreary reception in every drafty hall across every corner of the world. He gave 65 years of relentless public service to an institution that had stripped him of his title, his name, his career, and his sense of self, and he did it without once asking for permission to stop. But inside Buckingham Palace, away from the cameras and the crowds and the carefully managed public image, the warmth was draining out. Royal insiders from the period describe a marriage that functioned more like a professional partnership than a romance. Separate bedrooms, long stretches of distance, a formality between them at home that surprised people who expected to find the couple from the love letters. Philip threw himself into work, his patronages, his environmental causes, his Duke of Edinburgh award program, which quietly changed millions of young lives over decades. Elizabeth threw herself into being queen. They were both, in their own way, exceptional at what they did. What they were less exceptional at was finding each other in the middle of it. And yet, the people who were actually in the room, not the commentators, not the historians, tell a different story underneath that one. And tells that story. In an interview recorded not long after her father's death, Princess Anne sat with her brother Prince Edward and talked about their parents with the careful precision of someone who chooses every word not because she is hiding something, but because she knows the difference between truth and performance. She did not dramatize. She did not cry on cue. She spoke the way her father would have, directly, without decoration. She talked about the way her parents supported each other. Quietly, privately, in the way that people who have been through everything together support each other, not with grand gestures, but with a look across a room, a shared understanding that nobody outside could access. She talked about what it meant for each of them to have one person in the world who knew the full weight of what they were carrying. Edward echoed it. To have someone you can confide in. Someone you can smile with about things you could never show in public. That person, for both of them, was each other. So then why Sandringham? Anne answered that too. And she answered it the way Philip himself would have wanted it answered. Without drama. Without grievance. Without the theatrical explanation the world had been constructing for years. He was old, she said. He wanted space. He wanted to walk around a farm without 100 people trying to shake his hand. He wanted to hear birds in the morning and have some say over the temperature of his own rooms. He wanted, for the first time in decades, to simply be a man living in a place that felt like his own. That was it. That was the whole answer. Not revenge. Not a marriage in ruins. Not a final act of rebellion against an institution that had spent 50 years diminishing him. Just an old man, a man who had never truly had a home, finally allowing himself the dignity of one. There is something in that which cuts deeper than any scandal would have. Philip gave everything. His name. His career. His nationality. His autonomy. He gave it all to the crown and to the woman who wore it, and he never stopped. Not once in 70 years did he walk away from a duty he had agreed to perform. But in 2017, at 96 years old, he retired from public duties and moved to the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and the world decided this must mean something was broken. Maybe the harder truth is that nothing was broken. Maybe two people who loved each other genuinely had simply found, after a lifetime spent in public together, that they each needed a room of their own. Maybe a marriage can hold 70 years of loyalty, for children, 10 grandchildren, and the weight of entire monarchy, and still need a little air. Elizabeth visited. Philip called. When he was hospitalized in his final years, she was there. When he died, she was the only one in the room. Anne has said very little about that morning. But she has said enough. Her father was many things, complicated, private, occasionally infuriating, often misunderstood. But he was not a man who stopped loving his wife. He was a man who finally, at the very end of an extraordinary life, stopped pretending that a palace was a home. He had spent 99 years looking for solid ground. In the end, he found it in a quiet estate in Norfolk, with birds outside the window and no one waiting for him to perform. He was, at last, just a man. And maybe that was all he ever wanted to be. What do you think? Was Prince Philip's choice an act of quiet rebellion, or simply a man finally allowed to rest? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if stories like this stay with you long after they end, you know what to do.